one of the great gifts that religions of the world have offered us are methods, teachings, perspectives that emanate from a more kind of basic ground of being that exists before the conceptual mind kind of captures the attention of our identity. And it's the yearning of every heart, you could say, to connect back experientially with our primordial ground, because that's the basis of our freedom. So, yeah. In the ancient Hebrew tradition, many of the pathways that were articulated in the Torah, which is not just the Hebrew Bible, but is the totality of the teaching in all its dimensions, the oral teachings, the methods that were used, the practices, the embodiments of the teaching. The pathways are attempts to reconnect our consciousness to that innate state of freedom that is fundamental to who and what we are. But in the course of development of our, of our identity, the development of the psyche in childhood, we slowly become more and more disconnected from this ground and learn how to kind of approximate our true nature through taking on all kinds of identities that we know viscerally are not aligned with our deepest selves. That state of disconnect. Of course, since we're in this space, the Buddha talked about it in terms of the principle of dukkha, which is usually translated as suffering. But in the ancient Hebrew teachings, is also reflected in the Garden of Eden story, where we have this shift from dualistic mind into, or from non-dual mind into dualistic mind, where the mind all of a sudden begins to orient to its environment through a subject-object divide. That bridging, the unification of that dualistic mode of perception into a more unified, coherent, non-divided state of being is the ultimate goal of many spiritual paths and spiritual teachings, sometimes referred to as the non-dual state or the enlightened condition of awakening, the waking up. The prototype for this journey in the ancient Hebrew tradition is the story of Passover, which was just last week. Anybody here celebrate Passover? A few, okay. So this journey of Passover is, historically speaking, this narrative in the Hebrew Bible of the children of Israel enslaved in Egypt. But of course the Hebrew word for enslaved for Egypt is Mitzrayim, which literally means narrows or constricted states. And so we begin our journey in enslavement, in a constricted, contracted mode. This is the conventional state of consciousness. The state of being in Mitzrayim, of being in contracted perception, where we're perceiving reality through a very circumscribed range of experience. That range of experience is determined in large measure by our own developmental process, and what we had learned was appropriate and proper and okay for us to kind of navigate within as children. Yes? Excuse me a second. The movement out of Mitzrayim into freedom represents the journey of waking up in the tradition. And in fact, the Zohar, which is one of the great texts of the Jewish mystical tradition, calls the night of Passover an expression of itaruta dil Eila in Aramaic, which is the awakening from above, or better translated as waking up. The waking up is moving from a contracted mode of experience and perception into an expansive mode of perception, one that is not bound or defined or contained within the internalized boundaries of our developmental process. Min ha-meitzar karatiya anani bamerchavya, as it states in the Psalms and is read on the night of Passover. From contraction, I call out to you, God. Answer me, God, from expansion. And so the children of Israel, as the teaching goes, was deep in contraction on the 49th level, almost at the level of no return. And from that state, the text says, V'nitzak el Adonai, they cried out to God. And in that crying out, and in the trust that they had that there is indeed a benevolent spirit that animates reality that responds to our call, because it's b'zchuta emunah nigalu avotenu mitzrayim, through the merit of our trust where our ancestors redeemed from Egypt. And as we say on the Passover night, B'chol shana v'shana chayav adam l'rot et atzmo ki'ilu hu yatsa mitzrayim. This is not an event in history, but in fact every year it is incumbent upon the participants in this ritual feast, in this feast practice of the Seder, to recognize that we ourselves are being redeemed from Egypt, are expanding out of our contracted state into freedom and expansion. Not just our ancestors in some ancient historical time, but in this very moment, we do these rituals to participate in a transformation of our consciousness from one of constriction to expansion. So this technology of waking up is indigenous to the ancient Hebrew tradition, but oftentimes can be lost amongst, the food and the talk, even as the food and the talk and the speaking is an integral part of the actual process of waking up. As the ancient sages teach, Pesach, which is the Hebrew word for Passover, can be read as Pesach, the mouth that speaks. And the whole ritual of Passover revolves around speaking. We read the Haggadah, which means the telling of the story. It's the telling, the tale, speaking. The central section is Magid, which means the telling. Right? Kol hamarba l'saper b'yisias Mitzrayim hareza meshubach. Everyone who compounds their telling of the story of the freedom from Egypt, of the exile from Egypt, that is praiseworthy. The more the telling, the better, right? And what better way to tell a story than to be asked questions? So, of course, the ritual begins with asking questions. Asking questions like a child. How does a child ask a question? Not knowing, curiosity, engagement of the heart. They really want to know. And the sense of embodied, grounded presence. When we ask a question from this place, let's say you're with a lover. How do we want to be engaged by our lover? What wakes us up? What compels us to share our truth, to open ourselves up to the other? Trust. And a certain presence from the other, right? In the Kedumah teachings, we formulate it based on some basic Kabbalistic principles that are based on the three centers of consciousness. The belly center, which is really the extension of which are the arms and the legs and the body, right? Referred to as emunat ha'evarim in the texts, which is trust of the limbs, where we embody our trust in our actual physicality in our flesh. We have a sense that the other is present in a embodied way. They're steadfast, they are steady and true in their presence. You have the implicit trust that they're not going to get up and walk out, that they're here through and through as we open and reveal ourselves, expose our hearts and our soul. We want to know that our beloved really wants to know who we are. For its own sake, not to get something out of us, not to attain some kind of result or to fulfill some motive, but for its own sake. They just want to know because their heart wants to know the truth of who and what we are. And the more the mind is open in a state of not knowing, of expansiveness, of open to be surprised. We're not imposing some kind of a conceptual superimposition of who you are, in the space. But there's a sense of openness in the head center. That's what we call in Kedumah the three postures. And the book goes into great detail about how to actually embody these three postures, which aligns the consciousness and opens the center channel to be able to encounter not just the other, but our own contractions with presence, with curiosity, and with an openness of mind. Because ultimately, the journey of Passover is teaching us that with trust, with a certain kind of presence, and with speech, this is why Jews talk so much, by the way, with speech, some kind of alchemical process of transformation is available to us. Transformation of consciousness, actually. The early therapeutic tradition recognized this, and scholars already have demonstrated how deeply Freud was connected to Jewish teachings and to Jewish mystical teachings in particular. The importance of talk as a gateway to transformation of speech is deeply embedded in the Hebrew mystical tradition and even in the normative Jewish tradition. Okay? And I don't think it's an accident that so many of the early people involved in the development of Western psychology were connected to this particular Hebrew lineage. Okay? He'emanti ki adaber, the verse states, I trusted because I spoke. There is an intimate relationship between speech, speaking truth in particular, truth speak, and the development of trust. They go hand in hand. They're a dialectical pair. The more we trust, the more we're able to open and communicate. The more we communicate, the more deeper our trust becomes. Okay? The journey of Passover is a journey of movement from contraction into expansion, awakening of our consciousness. But it doesn't end there. In Kedumah, based on models from the Kabbalistic tradition, we articulate 5 journeys of freedom, progressive stages of deeper and deeper states of freedom. The first is the journey of contraction, which is the conventional state of mind. One that is, if not suffering in all the time, the baseline is one of dis-ease, discontent, with moments of contentment, joy, and connection. But it's kind of like, even if we're on the vacation and everything is perfect, we realize that it's basically impossible to completely manipulate our environment to suit our preferences. Right? And as we get older, that becomes more and more obvious. Basically doesn't work. Okay. At some point, we are compelled to wake up, to investigate what the heck is this about? Is this really all that there is? Is this kind of baseline of more or less dis-ease in our being, in our state of being? At some point, we may reach the 49th level that causes us to cry out. That cry out is the beginning of that movement, because creation happened through speech. Right? Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim vayomer Elohim yehi or vayhi or, and God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Creation, according to the ancient Hebrew tradition, happened through speech. And so human speech, as reflective of divine speech, has the power to create, to transform, to open up, to manifest realities, unknown realities. Yeah. So we use speech as a process of waking up to speak to our contractions, to confront our contraction just as we would a lover, with presence, with openness and curiosity of heart, with openness of mind. But this leads to the journey of expansion, which is the experience of presence. Presence, which is that mode of experience that is not bound by the conventional thinking mind. It's in the space right now. It's like it's permeating the space, not just in between the words, but it's actually the ground from which the words are arising. Sense it in your embodied experience. Sense what is here in the now. And you may begin to sense a certain kind of vibration through your system. A certain kind of presence that is alive. Yeah? That's not confined to a particular body, boundary. It's not limited by a thought or an identity. And it brings an inherent sense of expansiveness, of joy, of connection, of intimacy with the space and with each other. That's the journey of expansion. And this is what we're required to draw down to our children on Passover night, actually. The texts teach that the word for magid, to tell the story in Aramaic, is translated as vinagid, is lahamshich, to draw down. We're imparting experientially, we're transmitting to our children the state of expansiveness, of freedom, of presence. Yeah. But after enlightenment, we have to go back to work and go back to life. And this brings in the journey of wholeness, the third journey. And I want to speak to this a little bit because this is where we're at right now in the time cycle of the Hebrew calendar. All of this is mapped out in detail in the book. I'm just giving you sort of chapter headings, if you will. But you can find out much more detail in all the text and all that kind of thing. The journey of wholeness is what is referred to in the Zohar as itaruta dilatata, which is awakening of below, or from below, and what I poetically translate as waking down. So we have waking up, which is the journey from contraction into expansion. And then we have waking down, which is the journey of integrating our realization that comes in the expanded mode of perception with the embodied life of functioning, of relating, of engaging the full spectrum of our horizontally embodied human existence. One of the great challenges on the spiritual journey, if waking up is difficult because of the deeply ingrained patterns of our thinking mind and our deep identities with it, waking down is much more difficult than that. Okay? It's not that uncommon anymore for people to have states of awakening. We have spiritual technologies of many traditions that are freely available on YouTube. And there are certain technologies, spiritual technologies, that have instantaneous results. We can do some of those practices here. Right? But from the Kedumah perspective, waking up is not the goal. The goal is ultimately truth. And waking up, expansiveness, is necessarily, even logically so, in dialectical relationship with contraction. It doesn't exist without contraction. It's the other side of the coin, if you will. We experience it as expansion because of the contraction. And we experience contraction because we know deeply inside that what we are is not contracted. We know because we remember deep in our kishkas that what we are is way beyond contraction. So we experience it as dis-ease because we know what ease really is. And we experience ease because we know what dis-ease is. The journey of wholeness is the integration of that split between expansion and contraction. What often happens in the journey is we experience expansion and then it feels so good, we want that all the time. And so we try and manipulate our life to maintain a state of of expansiveness, to stay high. We may start, depending what style we are, shirking our responsibilities or turning away from relationships in order to meditate more because, God, we want to hold on to that state of divinity, of enlightenment, right? All that kind of stuff, right? So you can see that even if expansiveness feels really good, to the extent to which that becomes the new goal, there's still a suffering that is implicit in that process. It's the suffering of trying and efforting to attain something that we don't have. And there's always some kind of discontent in that process. The journey of wholeness, which represents this period known as Sefirat HaOmer, which is the ritual practice of counting the Omer, which is what traditionally is engaged in the Jewish tradition at this time of year, is the process of taking the realized state of the night of Passover, of expansion, and bringing that realization into, working into and through our psychological structuring, our psycho-spiritual kind of embodiment, and all the issues that we encounter day in and day out. See? It's like we're integrating all of the lights of being, the essential qualities that manifest, known as the Sefirot, and we're clarifying them, embodying them in our consciousness in deeper ways. So I want to read you a short section that talks about this particular journey, which is the journey of wholeness. And in the book, I share an example of one example of what this can look like in our day-to-day experience. Okay. The Sefirat HaOmer, this practice, ritualistically is about coming into wholeness or completion. So you count for 49 days, and the 50th day, the 50 represents the number of wholeness in the Kabbalistic tradition. And it's marked by a celebration of wholeness and of union with the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai on Shavuot. But in terms of the universal principle of that, it's the integration of the qualities of being into our life each day, integrating another aspect of us. So, so this is the section where I talk about how this works. When I first realized how this works, this is on page 153. And this is in the chapter on waking down. So I figured I'd share. I didn't know what to share. I figured this is the good time of year since we're in this process. I was in grad school, and as a young Orthodox rabbi at the time, I was also working part-time as a mashkiach, someone who oversees an establishment in the food industry to certify if it's kosher or not. My job at the time was to ensure that a particular Chinese restaurant was indeed kosher. This was in Boston. I was at Brandeis doing my doctoral work. And I would work in this Chinese restaurant. It was a kosher restaurant called Shalom Hunan. Do you know about Jews and Chinese food? Know about that? Yeah. You know the joke, right? According to the Hebrew calendar, right, the world is how old? 5,778 something years old. According to the Chinese calendar, it's, 2,374 years. So the whole question is what the heck did the Jews eat for 3,247 years? So I check all their deliveries, inspect their inventories to make sure everything was properly certified. While I was overseeing the restaurant, they hired a new manager who was uncooperative. There are many strict rules for a restaurant to be certified kosher, and for some reason, she kept trying to push the boundaries and break the rules. For example, she was bringing in food from outside the establishment for her own personal use. That was a no-no. You can't bring in McDonald's to a kosher restaurant. And so my job entailed not only overseeing, but revoking certification if necessary. I noticed as I was engaging with this person around this issue that it was really upsetting me in a way that didn't fit the situation. It was much more disturbing for me, for some reason, to the extent that it was keeping me up at night. I was perseverating over it and strategizing how to best deal with her and with the chief rabbis at the certifying agency. I felt tormented. At a certain point, I began to ask myself, what the hell is going on here? Why am I so upset by this? Has anyone ever had a situation like this in your life? When I thought about it, it seemed very straightforward. Yet I realized that I was totally engulfed in this story in a way that did not make sense. So finally, I decided to pray about it. At that time, I had a daily prayer practice. So the next morning when I was davening, praying, I asked God for help to understand what was happening here. It was a very sincere prayer. I really wanted to know what was going on. I really wanted to know the truth. I suddenly realized that my sincerity was enough. In a way, the felt sense of wanting to know the truth became more foreground, and the details of the situation fell to the background. I no longer even cared about how to fix the situation. I was more interested in the question, what is really happening here for me? I really just wanted to know. I remember that as I surrendered more deeply to the truth of really wanting to know, something spontaneous opened in me. First, I saw the divine name Elohim. Because at the time I was immersed in the Kabbalistic teachings, I knew that the divine name of Elohim had to do with the divine quality of justice, of din. In the system of the Tree of Life, which the book explains in much more detail, so sort of jumping in the middle of things here, justice is represented by the Sephira of Gevura, translated as strength. I wasn't thinking about it intellectually at the time, but when the name Elohim came up, I immediately knew that I was dealing with an issue around Gevura. As I stayed with the experience, I started to have memories come up from when I was a kid, experiencing people who were my caretakers and teachers of mine, who used their authority in abusive ways, or in ways that were not pure. As I remembered these things, I could feel the impact of those experiences somatically and viscerally in my body-soul. As I stayed with the painful sensations, I understood in that moment how experiencing those behaviors as violations, as attacks, made me distrust this quality of Gevura, the true light of strength when I was a child. I understood in the now of this experience how when I was a boy, I equated all expressions of strength with some kind of a violation or abuse. I could feel the pain of that. And then there arose the sensation of loss, a feeling of emptiness. When I allowed the raw embodied sensation of the emptiness to be there without judgment or manipulation, something very interesting happened. My entire consciousness became instantaneously absorbed in a pure, clear, spacious, red light. I felt this magical light shine through my heart as a discriminating, clear, red light. It was as if my entire body-soul had become more heartfelt and heart-centered with this particular quality, saturating my experience. Embodying this light, I could now see the situation for exactly what it was. With my consciousness absorbed in this light, and with this light expanding through me, I could see clearly how this pure light of Gevura was blocked in me, and how, as a result, I was relating to the situation in the restaurant with the feeling of inner conflict and turmoil. From this perspective of the red light of Gevura, the situation was absolutely straightforward and simple. The rule is you cannot bring McDonald's into the restaurant. If the rule is violated, there are consequences. You are fired, or I take away the certification, whatever it may be. It became clear that I was having difficulty acting decisively because I was feeling the stuckness and ambivalence that comes when the red light is blocked. I noticed that when the purity of Gevura was shining through my consciousness unobstructed, I had no hesitation, no inner conflict. I remember being in awe at its magnificence, how magical it felt. I then remembered having experiences like that before, but it was clear to me that until that time, I didn't recognize it for what it was, for this divine quality. One of the Sefirot embodying in my consciousness. I did not feel it through my heart soul with such vivid richness. I realized that I had not appreciated it as the embodiment of the divine red light of Gevura. So the next day I went back to the restaurant. Do you want to hear what happened? And as a result of not having any inner hesitation, resistance, or conflict, I felt an amazing freedom. No self-consciousness. It was very straightforward and matter-of-fact. I walked in and I said my piece. I spoke the truth, and I noticed that when it comes from that place, there is no psychic investment in the outcome, and there's no other content of the mind involved. I also noticed that it burns absolutely clean. It is not blaming, it's not attacking, nor is it cowering or mincing words or trying to say things in a polite way. It is utterly straightforward, simple, direct. What I realized in that encounter is that when we live these pure lights of being in our life, and I give many other examples in the book, their authenticity is so powerful that people respect it. They, in a sense, bow to it. They can agree or disagree, but this is true, one's personal truth that is being expressed cleanly. And it's all very simple. I expressed myself, I stated the consequences, and she got it, and it was not a problem after that. So I go on and sort of go into more of the ingredients of this experience, and this experience for me was a kind of opening into a whole process of what I call the Journey of Wholeness, which is the integration of these lights into our embodied human life. The Sefirot and all these mystical Kabbalistic teachings that everyone likes to talk about and get into all kinds of convoluted conversations, as if, especially, after people smoke a joint, they can talk about Kabbalah till... These are not abstract principles, my friends. These are embodied truths that can be experienced as the manifest qualities of reality that undergird every experience that we have. Our experience is either a kind of contracted distortion or twisting of one of these pure lights, or it's the pure light. If it's not the pure light, then we have interesting material to explore. And that's what I discovered, that the journey of wholeness is a lifelong journey that is realized and cultivated and embodied in everyday life. It cannot happen in a monastery. It cannot happen in a cave. It can only happen in the friction in our day-to-day encounters as it exposes our inner conflicts around manifesting in the world fully our divine nature and all of its beauty and color and light and potential. See? This process that we're in right now at this time of year in the ancient Hebrew kind of model is auspicious for this process. Okay? I want to leave some time for questions, but I will just mention briefly that the Journey of Wholeness, it doesn't end at the Journey of Wholeness. The Journey of Wholeness leads to a whole other experience, exploration of consciousness that I call the Journey of Vastness. And vastness has to do with the primordial light, which is an even more, it's the original light of creation. And it has to do with the transcendence of the categories of life and death, you can say. Not transcending beyond life, but transcending the concepts of life and death. And I feel moved. Do you guys have patience for another short story? This short passage is from chapter 10, which is on starlight. I call it starlight because my experience of vastness is like starlight, a vast non-dual light. And it can also be experienced as the actual star or point of light. In the Zohar, it reflects all of this. All those sources are in the book. If you're interested in sourcing all of these teachings in the ancient texts, you're good. You've got lots to chew on. The Zohar mentions the point of light over 100 times. The starlight, or the point of primordial light, is a dimensionless, timeless kind of state of being. That for me was what, entering into that mode was what began to reveal the Kedumah teachings. It's in that state that is prior to creation, if you can say, that is the source of spiritual teachings that are true teachings. If it's a true teaching, it has to be grounded in the primordial light. If it's disconnected from the primordial light, it might be cute and sweet, but it won't have the same transformational impact. See? All true teachings are grounded in that space. And as I speak to this, I can feel what has been cultivated in this space. Okay? And the kind of ground of being or of spaciousness that has revealed other teachings, you could say, have articulated themselves in this mandala of being that is continuing to constellate in this environment, in this atmosphere. So in this short passage, I'm talking about what happens when I move deeper and deeper into silence. After the Journey of Wholeness, for me, I found myself going deeper and deeper inside. And it revealed deeper and deeper places of silence. In the journey, what I call the journeys of silence, I start to say, it begins to challenge very deep psychological structures. Deeply held conceptual attitudes about who we are, what reality is. And I noticed that I went more and more into the silence. My notions of self and other, who and what I was and who and what other people were exposed as constructs of the mind. This is very difficult terrain to travel through because it conjures up all the instinctual energies of survival. You feel like your very life is being challenged by this exposure. This is because the deep silence is really a movement into the death space. Do you want to hear about death? Is death interesting? Along with this exposure of my self-identity, all kinds of other primitive structures emerged, which were very challenging to stay with. As I stayed with the practice, I delved into the intense difficulty of the terrain, and the material began to metabolize. At a certain point, there was a very distinct moment in which I had to choose between life and death. It was very clear. I knew that if I continued to go deeper into the silence, I would die. I realized at that moment that I also had the choice to stop. I could just emerge from the silence and go back to my conventional life. When this happened, I was already in some kind of an altered state, deep in meditation. The meditation was ongoing, even when I wasn't formally meditating. Then, when I was faced with this choice of life or death, I wonder if this is a universal phenomenon. I wonder if at some point on the journey of silence, everybody encounters this crossroads of life and death. A student interjects, says, "Do you mean the death of your body? Or the death of your ego? Or the death of your senses? What does that mean?" So I respond, well, at the time it meant the death of everything. I felt that my body would die. The feeling of it is life or death. I knew that if I chose death, I would have to be prepared for physical death. That was my understanding of it at the time. I'm not really sure what happens in such a situation if someone chooses life, but I imagine that conventional life would come back. I don't know because at that time I chose death. My attitude was, I really want to know what the truth is, and if it means death, so be it. In that instant, I was ready, I was willing to die in order to know the truth of reality. I was not going to turn back, and so be it if I die. It was a conscious choice. It was as if I was saying to God, I want the truth, I want you, so do what you will with me. At the time, I figured that would be it. I figured that I chose death and that I would actually die. And in a sense, I did die. There was a lot that happened in that instant that I'm not going to go into detail about here. It's another book. It's coming out. Basically, there was a very intense black fire that consumed my entire body, soul, and burned me away. There was literally nobody and nothing left at all. I know this does not make any sense, but I'm not trying to make sense. I'm simply reporting to you the nature of the experience. What's important for this teaching is that what emerged from this experience was the realization that nothing actually exists in the way we usually think it does. All the forms that we take to be solid and real in the conventional mode of perception were revealed to be empty of existence and substance. Even my physical body felt utterly transparent and empty, as if it didn't exist. In this state, there was a distinct absence of all the usual human concerns of body, life, death, so on. With this sense of vastness, those concerns were erased, because it was evident to me that I am not bound or defined by any of those things. In other words, nothing was ever born, and nothing will ever die. Reality is not bound by the concepts of time and space, of life and death. There's a lot to this, of course, and then I go on and sort of describe this experience. I describe the embodied experience of no self, what perception is like in that state, and the kind of wisdom that it brings to our lived human experience, why it's important. for a while, I thought that must be the ultimate truth. And it displaced the realization of wholeness and human, the embodiment of the qualities of the Sefirot. It seemed like this was more fundamental. But in time, as I matured, I realized that was an error. It was a mistake to recognize the journey of emptiness and the journey of vastness, which literally is the recognition that existence is not solid, does not exist in the way the conventional contracted mode sees it as existing, but is utterly transparent to light. That is possible to experience that, to see that. However, to create an idealization that is somehow an ultimate, that displaces other modes of experiences being equally true, I realized at some point in the journey, was problematic and not reflective of truth, ultimately. That brought in the fifth journey, what I call the journey of freedom. The journey of freedom, which is chapter 11, which I'm not going to read from because things will get really wonky. Journey of freedom is the harmonization, you could say, in the equalization of all modes of human experience, from the contracted to the vast, as equally real and equally true expressions of reality, of divinity. So there is no split, no compartmentalizing in realization. And the journey of freedom, I think, is so particularly relevant for our time because of the tendency to idealize spiritual experience over material experience or conventional experience. And so the journey of freedom speaks to that recognition. I want to end with just a word about tonight. In the Hebrew tradition, the Jewish tradition, tonight is a day called Yom HaShoah, which is Holocaust Remembrance Day. It's tonight and tomorrow. Also in this map of the Sefirot that we're moving through in Sefirat Omer, we're in a kind of harsh time. Okay, it's the night of Hod Shebegvura, which is a lot of a kind of intense energy. Yeah. So anybody going through hard times this week? It's going around. It's contagious this week. It's in the air. Okay. It's in the vibrations. In a way, Kedumah is a teaching that is birthed out of the Holocaust, you could say. Because it is a teaching that recognizes the meaning, the meaningfulness, the divinity, the wholeness, and the coherence of the horrors that were experienced, the contractions beyond comprehension, right? Personally, I was affected by the imprint of the Holocaust, since both my grandparents were survivors, only survivors in their whole family, and I grew up in a Holocaust survivor community with my grandparents in their home, was deeply impacted by that imprint. And it struck me how deeply was ingrained in the Jewish consciousness a distrust in the possibilities of true freedom. True freedom in this world where there's the appearance of so much cruelty is hard to imagine, especially to the human experience of that kind of suffering, to a history of accumulated suffering. Yeah. In my own journey of awakening, I had to kind of contend with those imprints of my birth lineage, of my own personal history growing up in an atmosphere of that kind of tragedy, that kind of imprint, energetic imprint, which is a particular tone to it. Yeah. It affects the consciousness, and I believe it has created a kind of, it is like a kind of cosmic wound in the fabric of humanity still to this day. Requires a sophisticated set of technologies for us to actually turn toward that wound as opposed to away from it. In the Kedumah teachings, healing and realization happens by turning toward our wounds and our pain and moving into them and through them. And so tonight is a perfect night, actually, to be speaking about freedom, speaking about the possibilities of experiencing divine compassion and primordial light that permeates every human experience, regardless of the depth of that contraction. That freedom is possible even as a transmutational force back into the past. See, because in the journey of freedom, it reveals that time and that the distance between moments in time and moments in space is a concept. It actually doesn't exist. What happened however many years ago, 70 years ago, is now. It's right here. It's inseparable. When we come into touch into our deepest places, we are inseparable from the wounds of all humanity. See? And through our practice and our touching into and speaking to the possibility of freedom, acknowledging it, embracing it, bringing it into the space, invoking it, becoming it, living it, not at the exclusion of our contractions and our suffering, but including our contractions and our suffering in that space, we have the possibility, I believe, to transmute their suffering, to transmute that event which we locate in history, just like we had with Passover, and we embody that potential for freedom at the Seder. We can embody the potential for freedom in the gas chambers, right here, by invoking it here and speaking to it with the presence of vastness, of freedom, of light, of compassion, of strength, of all the colors of the divine tapestry, of the palette of creation. It's all here. So may we be blessed, and we'll have a few minutes for questions. Each of us in our own way to really step into our path, whatever it is, so that as a collective human soul, say, we can begin to include more and more of the totality of what we are as a living human organism, and in that process, with and through the merits of that process, it bring a kind of healing to this human experiment on all levels of time and place. So, any questions? Then we'll have some time for... Yes? Kedumah, the question was, can I explain the difference between death and Kedumah? Kedumah is not bound by the concept of death or life. It's prior, that is to say, more primordial than death or life. So in the Kedumah place, the concepts of life and death don't apply. There's a sense of eternally abiding isness. You see? Does that make sense? Experientially? Yeah. Christopher.
Go into this deep silence, the concept of Judaism,
Yeah, so the question is, Judaism is so much about speech. Where's the silence coming? Yeah, the centerpiece of the practice is the Journey of Wholeness, which is all about speech. Journey of Vastness and the Journey of Freedom, for me, happened through silence. But the way I oriented to silence, and do orient to silence, is not silence of sound or silence of talking. It's the presence of silence. Like Rabbi Garfunkel and Simon explained. There can be a presence of silence even as we're speaking. That make sense? No. It's like right now, there's a palpable, you can feel like more of a palpable sense of silence. So the presence of silence, it's like going more deeply into presence itself, into the heart of presence. And instead of just saying, oh God, presence feels good, and bask in that light, we apply our curiosity, our presence, and our inquiry into the presence itself, get to the heart of presence. As we go deeper and deeper into presence, there's more and more kind of the mind starts gets like it doesn't start operating the way it usually does, and we're dropping into a mode of experience that is kind of underneath the thinking mind and all. It can almost feel like dropping into a tank of deep water. Like, have you ever gone diving? It's like the deeper you go, it's like the sounds at the surface become like, there's sounds there and you can kind of make them out, but it's like you're dropping into a deeper space and things feel more and more dense and kind of intense. And the thinking mind is like at the surface. And we're dropping in further and further, and the thinking is like more and more distant. And at some point, we've fallen deep enough where there's a precipice almost in the depth, where it's like, oh God, oh no, like I can't even feel my thinking mind anymore. It's somewhere far away, and I don't know if it's ever going to come back if I keep going in this direction. If we go in that direction, we go unconscious. I didn't talk about that in that passage I read, but there is actually like the cessation of the mind. It's as if everything goes black.
Kind of like drowning.
Yeah, it's a metaphor, but yeah, it is like that. And it's not talked about in the conventional Jewish context because this is the realm of mysticism, and it's not everyone's cup of tea. The Kedumah experience is a mystical text, is what it is, really. It's walking us through a mystical journey, an experiential journey. You can see its source, so you see sort of how this is actually what the Kabbalistic teachers were talking about. In fact, it makes a lot more conventional Jewish practice make a lot more sense, I think, because it points out how conventional Jewish practice, ritualistic practice, and is also just a reflection of these mystical states. But going into these states is not like for everybody, and it's not important for everybody to live a full, complete life. Contraction, expansion, and wholeness is perfect. It's like vastness and freedom is not, is kind of like, it's for someone who is called to explore that inner terrain. And, I just point out some of the things that I experienced. That's not to say that that's a universal phenomenon, but it's what I experienced. And then when I looked at the text, I saw, oh, look at that. At the time that I experienced those things, I was in an Orthodox Jewish environment. I had never studied other traditions. I had no idea what the heck was going on. So I didn't really have a context for it. But as I got deeper into Jewish mystical texts, and other traditions, of course, do speak about these things, it was like, oh, wow, this must be what they're talking about. It's kind of crystal clear from the perspective of the experience that that's what they're talking about. But it's not always crystal clear from the perspective of the text if that experience is not familiar. So the book tries to make that bridge for the reader. So it kind of bring you into some of those states if someone's interested in them. But really the important thing is, in the Kedumah perspective, is not to have mystical experience. It's to step more fully into our human potential, to live more fully in accordance with the design of our being, that we develop the confidence and the freedom to become, as the Talmud states, toho kavaro. Our inside is like our outside. That we're through ourselves a more full and total expression of our potential. That's really the point, of these teachings. Yes.
So when you were mentioning the contraction and the expansion, it sounds like the human experience kind of cycles between the two, and that they exist because of each other. And I'm curious what that relationship would be like between the wholeness and the vastness. And are they on their own cycle, separate from the contraction and expansion? Does that eventually cycle back to itself? Is it more linear? And maybe you can speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, it's a great question. Wholeness is like, you know how a pearl is born in a clam or an oyster through the friction of salt and sand over many, many years? This beautiful pearl is birthed. The journey of friction between contraction and expansion, and the spiritual, that's much of the spiritual journey, is this swinging back and forth between contraction and expansion. The friction that brings births a new kind of human being that I call the pearl, which is based on the principle of the penina, and I go into a lot more detail in the book, so you can see. The pearl is birthed as a human being that is an integration of contraction and expansion. So there's no longer a split. It's like a sense of innate wholeness where we develop a completely radically different relationship with contraction. It's no longer something that we're trying to transcend. It's something that we have learned is the very material that is birthing our potential. Does that make sense? So it's kind of like a radical shift in our relationship to contraction and expansion. I call it wholeness completion because it's that's how it's experienced. It's going to be experienced viscerally as a kind of full, content roundness in our being. We're like enfleshed as an organism of spirit that is at one in devotion to truth and to God, yet at the same time a full, like we're an offspring of the divine. We feel ourselves to be of God, of that wholeness, yet fully human at the same time. So it's in a sense the resolution of the split between contraction and expansion. Yeah. Vastness is a deeper state, a more subtle state of expansion, where things go kind of cosmic. It's where expansiveness goes cosmic. And then freedom is like a radical kind of equalization of all of the totality. Freedom is represented in the Kabbalistic tradition as Ein Sof. Total equalization of all experience. So, yes, in the back. Yeah, I know we have to wrap up. Yeah.
Well, this is more a personal question. I guess I just wondered if you had a particular experience that had really helped shift you and your family's relationship to the contraction. You mentioned the Holocaust.
It's been a long journey, and it's a journey that continues in many subtle ways. I would say a turning point for me was I've been to Auschwitz several times. This is where my family was killed. And the last time I was in Auschwitz, I had an experience of divine love that was so palpable, that was infusing the whole space, that was so present. It was like I felt like I was there, like I was walking to the gas chambers. Like that's how visceral of a time warp it was. Distance was erased, and it was like I could feel the whole thing. I felt myself there. And in that experience, I felt the suffering and just the kind of bizarre quality of disconnect from humanity that was operating in the space. And in that experience, there was the arising of this very indescribable kind of unconditional love that was so profound that it permeated the whole space, and it permeated not just those who were walking to the gas chambers, those who were in the gas chamber, but it also permeated through the perpetrators. It was totally unconditional. It was like everything was basked in this. And I realized that my presence in that space, and the presence of this quality of love in that space, was impacting the beings in that event, as if it was going back in history. But it wasn't going back in history, it was the now. There was an alchemical kind of process that was happening, and I realized in that moment that our work has impact on past. It impacts. Yeah. And it's like without the direct experience, I never would have believed that. And then it was so clear that was the case. And then I had experiences not just in there physically, but then in my home, tapping in through my heart space into that sort of translocal kind of thing, where I, as a practice, would go into the gas chambers. I would walk with these people into the gas chambers and go through the whole event, but in the process invoking this light and seeing like how that was an effect, how that affects the space. For me, that was healing, not just for me personally, but it became almost like a realization of the potential of human consciousness to traverse time and space and to heal the wounds of our ancestors in our time. Very profound thing, that we have that capacity. So, and it's still a journey. Like today, I was in my room shedding tears. I knew I could feel Yom HaShoah coming. And it's like, it's a very, very deep wound that's still in the fabric of the cosmos. Like I feel it in humanity. It's not worked out yet. It's really not. And I think our generation is maybe the first generation that's able to consciously turn toward it and like feel into that and hold that wound more consciously, with more intention. It's one of the holy works and processes I think we have the potential to do in our generation, in the coming generations. And as we heal that, we also, our own perception opens up, our heart feels more, not just our personal wounds and the wounds of our ancestors, but the neglected corners of this planet where genocides are not being, acknowledged or not being held. There's plenty of work for us to do, right? So thank you all so much. They're telling me I need to stop. So
Stop, will you count Sphira?
Count Sphira. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kedeshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al Sfirat ha'omer. Hayom 12 yom shehem shavua echad v'chamisha yamim la'omer. Amen. So today I just tell that. Thank you all so much. If anyone wants me to sign the book, I'm happy to do so. But thank you all for coming.
Do you? I'll get one.
Okay.
So Daraba?
What's your name?
Jocelyn. I'll be at many of your classes at Narupa.
Oh, are you at Narupa?
I'm going to audit yours.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, check out Kedumah, because I teach other things outside Narupa in town.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, at Kedumah.org.
Okay, great. I'm going to book now. Thank you very much for this teaching. Sorry. Do you want a picture with them? Oh, okay.
Thanks for coming. Appreciate it.
I'm going to get another one for me, and then I'll ask you to sign that some other time.
Great, thank you.
I left my other one at home, so that means I need to get another one.
Tell me your name.
Sherry, Sherry.
I feel like I've met you before.
No, but
Familiar,
you're
no?
just awesome.
Thank you. How do you spell your name?
Sherry.
Okay.
Yeah, when you were talking about the Holocaust, looking up in that corner, as a Native American, the American Holocaust too. It's like, so I'm glad you mentioned that, the other hidden circles of the world, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's pretty amazing that it's this night. I wasn't aware of that until you pointed that out. It's,
No, it's crazy.
Who's teaching this semester? Just the senior. Okay.
they seem to be releasing more documentaries on that now. It's like, I don't know if it was just too painful perhaps for them to, well, now there's Netflix and everything too, right?
Yeah. What do you think of that? What is this like? I'm not sure which one. It's the last year or two. Like that is the last. I'll be in touch. Very, very big work.